Welcome to Simply by Grace, a podcast of Grace Life Ministries with founder and director Dr. Charlie Bing. This podcast and other helpful resources can be found at our website, gracelife.org. Now, here's Dr. Bing.
Hey there. Are you ready to talk about fishing and a little about life? Before you think you're not interested in fishing, in fact, you may be bored by it, just wait and listen. Give this podcast a chance. Carmen Pate of Saving Grace Podcast asked me to do a 2-part podcast discussing my book, Fishing for Life. Now, the next best thing to fishing itself is talking about it and reliving the stories, which is kind of why I wrote the book. But Saving Grace Podcast is a ministry of Grace School of Theology with whom I've had a good relationship and ministry, and I was more than happy to help them. Now, the podcast combines 2 parts into one here, and it includes contact information for Grace School of Theology and all its ministries. I hope you enjoy the chat, which is not just about my fishing stories, but as you'll hear, about life itself. And I hope it motivates you to get several copies of Fishing for Life and share them with people you know who like stories and even fishing and who might just need to hear the gospel as it's presented in the book, which is why I really wrote it. So anyway, enjoy the conversation and let me know what you think by giving us a good rating or leaving a comment and share the podcast with others. Okay, so here we go.
Hello, I'm Carmen Pate, and I'm your host for today's program. You know, one of my fondest childhood memories was fishing with my dad. He otherwise was a pretty harsh man who had a lot of unresolved baggage. But when we were on a boat on the Little Red River in Arkansas, fishing for trout or brim, he became a different person, a person that I enjoyed being with. You know, he often commented that on the river is where he could worship God best. And I was always glad to hear that because he didn't attend church with us. You know, those memories came flooding back as I read an enjoyable yet powerful little book titled Fishing for Life, Insights for Living from a Jerk at the End of a Line. Yes, it's a book about fishing, but oh, it's so much more. The author, and also our guest today, takes us beyond the fish on the end of the line to capture the lessons of life and the beauty that surrounds them, all while enjoying the skills of fishing. Our guest is Dr. Charles Bing. He's the founder and director of Grace Life Ministries. He earned his master's and his doctorate in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Bing has served 25 years in pastoral ministry. He's a co-founder of Free Grace Alliance and is a former president of that organization. He has authored several books, including Simply by Grace, Lordship Salvation, Living in the Family of Grace, among others. And today, we want to explore together with Dr. Bing his book, Fishing for Life. Welcome back to Saving Grace, Dr. Bing.
Well, thank you, Carmen. Good to be back.
Well, you know, my memory of fishing as a child is about the extent of my fishing experience. But I can tell you that I could not put your book down. Your detail brought me to those many places across America and the Caribbean islands that you went to. And I could sense your love of fishing through it all. I'd love to ask you if you were to just list 3 or 4 reasons why you love to fish, what would you say?
Well, I think you're an illustration of one of the reasons is it just gives you a good memory and a good memory of good times outdoors. And I think that's the reason I like to fish so much is because it gets me outdoors where things are simple, sometimes predictable, sometimes unpredictable. And you have to be a real student of the outdoors to appreciate things like fishing or hunting or whatever you're trying to do. And it brings your skills of observation to the surface. And I just love being outdoors. It's just a beautiful setting. But there's the other part of it too, which is the challenge of catching a fish in its own element. So you're on its turf, so to speak. And so you have to learn to think like a fish, which shouldn't be too hard since I don't think fish have big brains, but you know, they know how to survive in a tough environment.
Yeah.
But the excitement of catching something from a different world, because usually we see water, we just see a glare of water, and yet we were able to bring it out of its world into our world. And just the thrill of and the challenge of doing that, I guess, has always appealed to me.
Oh, yes. Well, I can certainly see why. Well, who would you say is your target audience for your book? And what are you hoping that your audience will take from it?
Well, here's what happened. I love stories and I record my fishing stories for over the years. And I do the same with my hunting stories, which is coming out sometime in the future. But I started to look for a book. There are some books written for fishermen, but they're written from a Christian perspective to Christian, kind of like devotionals. I looked for a book that would present the gospel clearly to an unbelieving fisherman, and I could not find one. And there's 55 million people in America that like to fish. And when I found out some of them could read, I said, well, you know what? I said, I would like to use my stories to draw them into the book and then weave into it observations about life and about God and eventually about the gospel, but not in a preachy way. And so that's what I do. The gospel comes out most clearly in the afterword. And I tell people, hey, if you don't want to hear it, just put the book down, tight lines. But if you want to know about how to have eternal life, just keep reading a few more pages. So that's the reason. And what I have found is exactly what you say, is that many people will buy the book for their husbands or friends, wives or whatever, but they read it themselves and they say, you know, I really like the stories. And even though they're not fishermen necessarily. So that's been an interesting side blessing.
Oh, no doubt about it. Well, I love the format of the book and your target audience. It's just beautifully done. Beautifully done.
Thank you.
Well, you share that your love for fishing was passed on from your dad and started when you were about 4 years of age. Could you invite our listeners into that moment in time when you hooked that first fish and fishing hooked you, as you said?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to remember exactly the first fish I caught because we were always doing something in the creek nearby, but we used to go to a lake in our area that was real accessible and close to home. So even after work, my dad would take us up there and we would usually throw out a worm under a bobber. And that was the most exciting thing to see. That there's nothing more exciting in life than seeing that bobber start to wiggle or start to skim along the surface because you know there's a fish pulling it. But most exciting was when that bobber would just disappear under the water. And now you know something big on there. And then you catch a fish, and usually they were just bluegills, sunfish, and occasional bass. But just the thrill of that excitement, anticipation, the optimism about what you could catch, and then actually catching a fish, it really hooked me. And it's, you know, we say the tug is the drug. When the fish get bigger and you feel that pull on the line, it really is kind of an addicting thing for people.
Yes, yes. So exciting. And particularly for children too. We've had a couple of our grandkids, a couple of our grandsons this summer on separate occasions. Bob took them fishing and each of them caught their first fish. So they had been many times fishing, but they each caught their first fish, were thrilled. And of course, we did all sorts of things while they were with us. But when you asked them what they enjoyed most, it was catching that fish. So it is a beautiful thing. Well, you know, you talked about weaving in some spiritual things throughout your book. And again, you just did it in such a beautiful way. And one was a story, if you could just kind of recount that story, a fishing encounter, I guess you would say, with a school bully and a nemesis that really had an unexpected eternal impact on your life down the road. Would you tell our listeners about Jerry and the circumstances that changed your life?
Sure. Jerry was my neighbor, actually, and he was in our school also. He was in our class. But he was kind of a bully in the neighborhood. He liked to pick fights. He liked to just cause trouble. And so one day we were fishing down at the little local creek and catching little chubs. And he comes up and insists on letting us try. So, you know, you don't want to start a fight, so you let him try. And he hooked a fish, and that was good enough for him. And he goes off. But Jerry had quite a story to him. During my childhood, he was a nemesis in the fact that he always was wanting to fight or throwing rocks at us or something. But when we got into our teenage years and to a rebellious stage in my life, he had kind of always been a rebellious stage in my life. I started to follow him in some of his rebellious ways, and he got me started smoking marijuana and things like that. And then we ended up partying a lot together. And we did that. He developed a drug habit. I did not. But he was into hard drugs, and he went to the Army, got discharged because of that, and was forced to go to a rehab program called Teen Challenge. And there at Teen Challenge, he became a Christian, and he would come back after that and talk to me about it. And I wasn't too interested in changing my lifestyle, but I listened and I was curious. And so, but he kind of got drawn back into the lifestyle of partying and drugs with me. And one night we were out at a party, and he took an overdose of drugs. I didn't know he was going to do it. I saw him buy it. I got mad at him because I thought that would mess up our whole party if he started doing those drugs. And anyway, long story short, we went home. We got in a big fight that night, and then we went home, and a little bit later he comes over and we make up and we go out and we get some more drinks and beer or something. You know, we're not even of age at this point. I think we're 17 or 18, and go back home at 3:00 in the morning and say, see you tomorrow. And next thing I know, no, not my wife. I wasn't married. My mother waking me up at 9 in the morning saying, hey, wake up. Jerry's dead. He had died in his sleep. He had taken those drugs in his sleep, and he was 18 years old. I was 18 years old. And that just sobered me up. And I got to thinking, you know, I'm heading down that same path. And you think that teenagers are invincible, but I started to realize the same thing could happen to me. So I started to change my life externally, cutting my hair and getting a job and things like that. And it was about 6 months later in that job, I met a young lady who shared the gospel with me. And in the summer of 1973, about a year after Jerry's death or so, I came to know the Lord.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
Well,
and the story is even more wonderful than that, because his brother and his father came to know the Lord also.
Oh, that's awesome. We never know what's going to happen and with the encounters that we've had in life and where they'll lead us, but God knows. God knows.
Yeah.
Well, you know, your childhood and teen years were full of fishing stories along the creeks and the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. area. You started out with bamboo poles and cork bobbers because the simplicity of it certainly didn't matter, but your heart was set on something bigger. You talk about how fly fishing in faraway places was really what you dreamed of. And you share an experience in Spillway Creek in Beavers Bend State Park in Oklahoma that started as a very difficult and frustrating morning, casting doubt on your fly fishing dreams. But you said God showed up in an unusual way, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, I love the fly fish. And so we went to this southeast Oklahoma stream, which is almost like being in the Rockies, the way it's structured. And it's a very popular place for fly fishermen. And so when we arrived at the parking lot, I started to put on all my gear. Well, I realized I didn't have I think it was my reel that I had left back at the cabin. So I had to go drive back there, killing about 45 minutes. Got back to the parking lot and the sun's beating down, and I'm putting on all my gear and threading the lures, and you can't have barbs on your hook, making sure I press them down with pliers, and one frustrating thing after another. So about an hour and a half later, I'm dripping sweat because it's going to get cold in the evening in October. I'm dripping sweat. I'm frustrated about all the things that have gone wrong. My friend has already been fishing about an hour. I finally join him and, catch one or two small fish. And so that was that for that day. But the next morning we got up and we hit the stream early. And that morning there was I was fishing near these rocks, and this mist is coming off the water, and then the sun peeks out behind the trees, and it just is a real ethereal, mystical type of scene, mystical, pun intended, type of scene. And I threw my friend the camera, and I said, here, take a picture. Take some pictures. And one of those pictures is on the cover of the book, another's on the inside of the book. But it was just a beautiful setting. And then to catch a few trout and to see a deer walk across the stream at the same time just reminded me that fishing can be a big hassle sometimes, but sometimes it's worth the hassle because you have those beautiful moments where just God shows up and everything works right.
Oh, yes. I love that story because that's the way our life is too, isn't it? It can be so frustrating and such a hassle and all the chaos and all the noise. And yet there'll be it might be a sunset or a sunrise or whatever where God just is there. And it's like he is begging for your attention.
Yeah.
And when you give him that attention, it's a beautiful experience. No doubt about it. Well, you humbly admit that you don't always catch fish. You say that it's why it's called fishing, not catching.
Right.
I love that. Well, certainly there are life lessons learned early on by fishermen regarding their dry spells, if you will. You noted that one of your favorite Bible stories is found in the 21st chapter of the Gospel of John. Remind us of that story and explain why it's significant to you.
This is a story about after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. At least Peter and some of the disciples going back to fishing because that's what they knew to do. I'm sure they were a bit disoriented by the death of Christ and they weren't catching anything. They weren't having any luck. And Jesus tells them to throw the net on the right side of the boat. And then they catch more fish than they can haul in. Actually, 153 fish. And Peter recognizes Jesus as the Lord and comes to him and they enjoy a nice breakfast together. It reminds us of the story of Luke chapter 5, where Jesus told Peter to do the same thing. And surely that must have been Peter's mind in his thinking. And the lesson from that is not about fishing. It's about doing what the Lord says to do. And I think there is an application there for fishing for men. We can't do that without the Lord's help. He has to direct us and tell us what to do. And when we follow in obedience, we can catch fish, so to speak, or fish for men successfully. And I think he was doing that because he was just ready to commission Peter into ministry in John 21 after his restoration. So it's a great story about restoration of Peter and the beginning of his ministry and the lesson learned that we have to depend on the Lord for everything to be fruitful or to catch fish, so to speak.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And just so our listeners know, you're telling fishing stories all through, and then you throw in these little nuggets of just time with the Lord just for a moment, and it just takes us back. And I appreciated that so much. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to return to the story of your dad. You said that he was your tutor when it came to fishing, but he also taught you things like patience and hard work and honesty and commitment and frugality, all wonderful things. But like my dad, your dad could be difficult, you said. As you began to grow in your relationship with Christ, you did find grace to forgive, but you say there's some things you regret that didn't happen sooner. Share the reason for your regret and the hope that you now have for seeing your dad again.
Yeah, sure. My father was a good man. He was faithful to the family and provided for us. He didn't drink at all, but he was emotionally kind of abusive and would yell a lot and things like that. And of course that would turn us off. The only time we really seemed to have common ground was when we went fishing. And I did learn a lot from him. He was very patient and in fishing and he was always willing to take us. But in my teenage years and my rebellious years, of course, things went sideways with him and I did a lot of things I'm sure that caused him grief. To think back to the things I did and to imagine that my kids would have done some of that to me just, really hurts my heart today. So in my teenage years, I wasn't too interested in going fishing with him. Even after I became a Christian, I just became so busy with school and friendships and activities that he would, sometimes ask me, do you want to go down to the stream? I'm catching trout down there. And I just didn't have time. I was nice, but I just said, well, I'm sorry, I just can't do it. And looking back, I wish I had made the time because, our time with our parents is always limited and there would have been a good memory. And I think that he was actually trying to build back the relationship as I look back, something that I didn't see at that time. If I had seen that, maybe I would have taken some time to go fishing with him. But anyway, there reached a point in my early Christian life where I went to my parents and I asked them both to forgive me for my rebellious behavior. And I think that caught my father's attention. He didn't react real good to that, but he did later on. You could tell that it had penetrated his conscience. And so he began to support what I was doing in seminary training and things like that. And he eventually came to know the Lord on his deathbed. And I'd been praying for him every day since I'd been saved. And he came to know the Lord on his deathbed. And he said to keep on doing what I'm doing. And he didn't understand it at first, but now he was fully supportive. So yeah, it ends well. And I'm looking forward to seeing him again in heaven and,
Absolutely.
along with my mother.
Absolutely. Yes. But a good life lesson for us all. None of us are promised tomorrow, and those that we love the most, we long after they're gone for those precious times that we had with them, even through the tough times. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Really do. Well,
Sure.
we're going to have you back next week, but there's the story that I want you to share, if you will. So many stories that we haven't hit on, but if you will close today with a story of catching your first ever steelhead on the Willamette River, right in the middle of Eugene, Oregon, and the life lesson that God gave you there.
Yeah. Well, I've tried to catch a steelhead in my visits to Oregon. And the reason I get to fish so many places is largely because I travel in ministry. And so whenever I'm in a place, I try to bring my rod or borrow a rod or something and fish something new. But I'd been to Oregon quite a few times and tried to fish for a steelhead, catch a steelhead. I wanted to do that. They're ocean going rainbow trout, basically. And, they get 8 pounds maybe the first year and then 20 pounds if they come back a second year up the stream, something like that. But they're very difficult to catch. Their run is kind of sparse in Oregon, and they're called the fish of 1,000 casts because you just have to work and work and work. And if you hook one or two during the day, that's considered a good day. And then if you hook a steelhead, there's a 50% chance you're not going to bring it in. It's going to get off the hook. So I had my pastor friend out there, Steve Hill, had a friend in his church named Greg Hatton who makes wooden boats, beautiful wooden river boats. And he offered to take me out fishing and went with him in this beautiful boat. And he knew where the holes were and so forth. And what they call swinging flies in the current behind the boat, and hooked up with a really nice steelhead and was fighting him and got him up near the boat. Now, the water was shallow enough for Greg to step out of the boat, and with his net, he was real proud of this net from Costa Rica that somebody had sent him from Costa Rica who made fishing nets, but it was kind of small. So he went to hook this 8 or 9 pound steelhead and got it in the net, but it flipped out. Those steelhead are very strong. So it flipped out, went back in the water. So I'm lucky to get it in the net to begin with. Now it's tangled in the line. The line's wrapped around it. And so I'm thinking, oh boy, I'm going to lose this fish. But we were able to get it back in the net and land it this time. And so that was my first steelhead adventure. And Greg did a great job. And I didn't know it the whole time, but he was filming the whole thing on a GoPro. And GoPros were new to me back then, but he had them in the boat. He had them on his hat and everything. And he put a little video out on YouTube called Lonesome Steelhead because he used the music from Lonesome Dove since I was from Texas. So it's a really neat little video to watch. You can see the whole story I just told there on Lonesome, if you Google Lonesome Steelhead or go to YouTube. But the lesson there is, first of all, persistence, and you can eventually reach your goal. I did hook a steelhead, but then I lost it virtually when it jumped out of the net. And, something like that usually tears the lure out of the mouth or something, but we were able to get it back in the net. And so we had a second chance. And I guess the lesson I draw from that is that God gives us second chances. He's the God of second chances. He never tires of new beginnings. And no matter what kind of failure you think you've had or whatever seems to impede your progress or inhibit you from your goal, God can overcome that if you're patient. And even if you fail, God can give you a second chance. Even when you fall and stumble, God gives a second chance. He's a God of second chances. So I just drew that lesson from that little experience and that story.
I love that. I love that. Well, in closing, it's obvious from your book that not only do you love fishing, but you love to help other people learn to fish. What is your motive when you're helping someone learn to fish?
I just want them to feel the kind of joy that I feel when I fish. And it, it gives them a sense of accomplishment to catch a fish. It puts a big smile on their faces. I think a lot of reason people don't like to fish today when I talk to them is because they didn't have a good experience at first and they didn't catch anything. It was just a boring day of sitting in a boat or standing on a bank or something. And nobody really showed them how to do it and have success. And so I like to show people how to have success, take them a place I know that they can catch something, show them some real simple things. And they get just a great feeling of accomplishment by catching their own fish. It seems like a small thing in life, but to them, it's something they'll remember the rest of their life, just like you do and I do. It's a story and they'll remember it. But so it's very gratifying. And then I see these young people that I taught down the river now with their children. And and that's good because I can ask them where the fish are and get fishing tips from them. So
that's beautiful. And I just love you talk throughout the book about seeing someone that maybe they were doing something incorrectly and you could interrupt and help them out or show them where a good spot was. And that does mean a lot because you want them to enjoy the fishing, but to develop a love for it. And again, I love that you drew a spiritual analogy even there that, if you don't catch anything, there's nothing to keep you coming back. You might wander away. And that sometimes happens with our faith. We're not looking to try to just feel good, but we do want to be hooked into loving Jesus and where we stay with him forever. And certainly just reading his word every day draws us to that love, doesn't it? Well, before we get to some more fishing stories, explain, if you will, your thoughts behind the title and the subtitle of your book.
Sure. The book is called Fishing for Life because I want the reader, the prospective reader, to understand that this is more than about fishing, but it's also about life. And people define life differently. Some people say life is tennis, life is football, life is golf, life is my pet. Some people would say life is fishing. Life is whatever we're really most passionate about, and that gives us meaning and purpose for existence. And some people find that in their hobbies. And some people consider fishing their life or hunting their life, things like that. So we want to talk about what life really is. And of course, you and I would say life is Jesus Christ. And that's, we don't want to put anything before him. And so that's the design of the book, is to try to lead people to understand that real life comes through Jesus Christ. And hopefully they'll understand that fishing, as good and fun as it is, from these stories will show them that there's something deeper that we can call real life, abundant life, life with Christ. The subtitle of the book, Insights for Living from a Jerk at the End of a Line, it comes from an old saying that fishermen are familiar with. Fishing is one jerk on the end of a line waiting for another jerk on the end of a line. So I know that a lot of fishermen know that line, and I thought it would be familiar to them. And since it's a little humorous, it might hint to them that there's some humor in the book and it's not a real serious book. I mean, it is serious in its own way, but there's humor in it and they're fun stories. So that's what I tried to communicate with the title and subtitle.
Yes, yes. And I just love it. You've done just a beautiful job in that. We talked last week about your audience and I couldn't help but think about my dad. My dad was a believer, but did not attend church all through my growing up years. There had been some things that happened in his life, and I don't know if it was shame or just what, but regardless, he would always say, well, I go to church when I go fishing. He really connected with the Lord and the environment when he went fishing. But I thought, I wish he had your book. So I just see the value in this for, I think, maybe spouses that are listening who think, oh my goodness, they just want to fish. They don't want to go to church. They don't want to worship. You really do this in a beautiful, gentle way of letting them see God in creation and what the sport is, but where the real beauty is that relationship with Jesus. So I appreciate, again, your intent and just wanted to point that out to our listeners.
Well, Carmen, they say that Religion is a man sitting in church thinking about fishing. Relationship is a man fishing thinking about God. So,
Love that.
we can be in church, but not necessarily be spiritual. But there's a lot of spirituality when we get outdoors.
No doubt about it. No doubt. Well, you have helped so many people over the years in helping them to learn to fish, but you are kind enough to share a few simple rules for better fishing in your book. Would you share a few of those with our listeners?
Okay. Well, these are sometimes tongue-in-cheek rules, but for example, you have to go where the fish are. You can't just go to the most convenient place, but sometimes it takes work hiking where people aren't and where there's going to be more fish. You have to give the fish what they want. And that means learning their diet and their habits of eating. So give the fish what they want. That's a matter of experience and mastery of whatever kind of fish you're going after. And, it's got to be the right bait at the right level on the depth of the water and presented in the right way at the right time, the right tides or whatever. There's a lot to be learned there.
Yeah.
Another rule I always tell my friends in my family is that you catch more fish with your line in the water than out of the water. I take kids fishing, my grandkids included, and they're always running around looking for another hole to fish in. And meanwhile, I'm staying in one spot and I'm catching more fish than them. And I say, you know why I'm catching more fish than you? Because my line's in the water more than yours. So that's an important lesson. It sounds simplistic, but it's really important. Keep your line in the water. And yesterday is another lesson. Yesterday, the fish we're always biting. It's kind of a joke, but every time we go out, not every time, but when we go out fishing, there's always somebody there that seems to say, oh yeah, yesterday we limited out. Yesterday it was going crazy, Or my sister's brother's mother-in-law was catching fish or something. Right. And then tomorrow is always the best day for fishing, I always say, because you always have that anticipation, that optimism. So, and another important rule is when you can take a kid fishing, you can go fishing or take a kid fishing, but you can't do both. So any parent of young children or grandparent knows that to take a child fishing means that you're going to be spending most of your time tying hooks, untangling line, baiting hooks, taking the fish off, et cetera, et cetera. But it's worth it.
Oh, no doubt about it. No doubt. As a matter of fact, I'll have to share this story. My husband, when he was taking one of our grandsons who was 11 fishing, and realized he was catching his first big fish. So my husband laid down his line, his pole and was waiting, to get a fish, laid down his pole so he could go and help him bring that fish in. Well, while he was doing that, a fish carried off his pole, his line, everything. It was gone. Because then it happened just so quickly. But
wow, that's the kind of fish you want to see.
That's right. Exactly. The big one that got away, right?
Yeah, that's a memory he wouldn't forget for a while.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, you say that most fishermen eventually become philosophers. Explain what you mean.
Well, I just wrote a chapter where I waxed a little philosophical. I often wonder why I like to fish so much and why I wake up at 4 a.m. and go stand in the water freezing. I don't know that I've really come to any really good answer for that. But I think most fishermen eventually become philosophers in the sense that there's a certain phase in life where you're discovering, you're learning, and you're excited about it, and everything's new. And then there's another phase in life where you become really masterful at it, and you begin to become fruitful and harvest fish, and you become confident in your skills. And then there's a point where fishing doesn't become so important as not catching fish doesn't become so important. It's just the experience of fishing. And you become a little philosophical about it and start to wonder, why am I here in this freezing weather in the rain where I could be standing sitting in a nice warm home drinking a warm drink or something. And you just start asking these questions of yourself for why you're doing it. Or you just sit back and, it's not so much what you're catching or not catching, but you just lay your pole aside and just enjoy the clouds, the birds, and the sound of the water, something like that. So you reach a point, I think, in not just fishing, but in a lot of things in life where it becomes so familiar to you, and you've become what you feel like is competent at it, and you can just sit back and enjoy the other elements that you don't usually pay attention to, or enjoy watching somebody else fish. So just becoming a little philosophical about it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
joke that wives don't often appreciate philosophy. They don't always understand what we're doing. It's not just wives, but all spouses.
Of course. Of course. Well, I think, you're right too, though. And you go and it's quiet. It's beautiful because God's creation just is beautiful. We get so busy in life. We don't stop to smell the roses, if you will. We don't stop to appreciate all that he has around us every day that we're just too busy to take time to look at. And I think stopping to think about him and thinking about the blessing and grace of what he has given us in that moment is a beautiful thing. And we need to do more of that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I gathered throughout the book that you prefer fishing without a guide, but you explain that sometimes guides are necessary. Talk about the ups and downs of having guides and even some God appointments, if you will, for particular guides that either did not know the Lord or did know the Lord, and resulted in good conversation.
Sure. I have a chapter talking about fishing guides. I never used a guide very much, mostly because they're expensive and I never had much money being in seminary and starting a new church and things like that. But when now and then I had occasion to either somebody help me get a guide or afford a guide myself, or somebody just offer who had guiding capabilities. And it's really always worth it to go with a guide. They know exactly what they're doing. They know the water. They know the fish. They know the lures to use. And you just learn so much from them. It's always worth it to have one. But guides are different. It's funny because some of them don't talk very much. Some of them talk too much. Some of them are bossy and telling you what to do, or will even scold you or something that you're not doing it right. And that gets on your nerves a little bit. But I always try to find out a little bit about them, relate to them as people, and see if there's any opening for sharing the gospel with them. We had one guide I'm thinking about named Pate on Tillamook Bay on the Oregon coast. And we were going after Chinook salmon, but it was late in the season. We didn't have a good shot at it, but I think we wanted to do this because my friend Hirsch Lang, who lives up there in that area, and Joe Lombardi, who has since gone to be with the Lord, was moving out of Oregon. And I was there in Oregon visiting. And so we just kind of wanted to get together and have that fellowship together. Hirsch had an interesting past. He was a policeman, and a perpetrator pulled a gun on him, and he shot him. He shot the perpetrator and paralyzed him from the waist down. And the man went to prison. But when he got out of prison, he became a Christian in prison. When he got out of prison, he and Hirsch went around to churches doing this cop and convict thing and sharing their testimonies. So Hirsch was just an excellent, wonderful, wonderful guy to fish with. And Joe Lombardi has been a pastor and a friend for a long time. And he was just moving from his church in Oregon to a church in Nebraska. So he wasn't going to be able to salmon fish. So I thought it would be fun. And we got into conversation with Pat, and he heard us talking about spiritual things, and he expressed the fact that he didn't understand much of the Bible, didn't know much about it. And we answered some of his questions and got in good conversation, shared the gospel with him, shared literature with him. He had obviously been through some difficult times from the things he told us, and he was very open to hearing the truth. That doesn't always happen, but I always now carry my book with me and give it to my guide at the end of the trip. So that's always a good thing. The last one, I just gave it to a guide in New Zealand, and he said, "Oh, good, I have something to read tonight." So that made me feel good. Yeah, he was going to read it that day. Okay.
That's great. Good story. Well, you must share your last adventure on the Devil's River in Texas and your comparison of that to life itself.
Well, Devil's River is a fascinating river in southwest Texas. It feeds into Lake Amistad, which is on the border with Mexico. It's the only wilderness river in Texas. It comes out of the ground, so it's pure, clear, cold water. And here in this
Wow.
middle of this desert, there's a population of smallmouth bass, which usually like deep, cold water. But because the water is cold there, smallmouth bass thrive along with other species. I've gone down the river 4 times. It's always difficult. 3 times in a canoe, and it's always difficult not to capsize because the rapids could be pretty mean and vicious, and you're getting out half the time and walking your canoe or kayak down the river. It's very rough. You're exhausted at the end of the day, and you camp out on the river on rocks or something below the water level because there's private property all around. On the last trip I went, I decided to take a kayak, which is a little tougher because your center of gravity is higher. It's a little harder to stay upright, and I capsized about 4 or 5 times on that trip.
Oh my goodness.
One of the things we always do is when we approach the largest natural waterfall in Texas, Dolan Falls, which is a 12-foot waterfall, you have to get out of your canoe or kayak and pull it over to the side and then portage it down, meaning carrying it down over the rocks with the help of your friends and into the pool below the waterfalls because you can't run the waterfalls. Well, I tried to get out in time, but it had rained and swollen the river just a couple inches, but a couple inches makes for a lot of power. And I got a little ahead of my friends. I shouldn't have. I should have stayed in sight of them. And I got out of the kayak, but I couldn't pull it over because the water was too strong. And now it was getting swept into the main current on the waterfall. And I just was with it. And the only thing I could do was to hang onto the kayak next to it, not in it, next to it. So we both went over the waterfall. The fellow who had brought us down to the river and carried us down there, shuttled us down with our kayaks in a trailer, told us about somebody that went over the waterfall, broke his ankle, and had a purple elephant's foot, he called it, for the next whole day, because you can't get off the river for at least 24 hours to get any kind of care. You can't walk out of there. And so I was thinking the whole time I was going over that waterfall, purple elephant's foot. So when I hit the bottom, hit the rocks, I collapsed my knees so that I wouldn't be stiff and hurt my ankles, and it worked. I survived it, but I lost hundreds of dollars worth of fishing gear and my camera and everything. It was a lesson. It was a lesson about safety, staying with your friends, and being careful. But the Devil's River, it's a fascinating history. I talk about some of the history in the book. It's a place where the Pony Express used to go. Indians gathered, the cavalry gathered. They all gathered there because it's like the only water in the area. So it has a lot of history, and I tell some of those interesting stories. But the river itself is a journey that I often compare to discipleship because there's many channels to go down. And if you pick the wrong channel, you may go quite a distance and find out that it just is the dead end and you got to back up. And then you capsize. And then sometimes the wind is in your face and you're struggling with all your might to make progress. Other times it's in your back and it's easy going. So it's just a lot of things that are analogous to the Christian life and the ups and downs of the Christian life, the challenges, the trials, the danger sometimes of the Christian life. And I thought the Devil's River was just a good story to talk about those things.
Definitely. And quite the adventure, which certainly life is, isn't it? And you are going to take risk. You're going to do things that may not be popular for everyone, but boy, the rewards when you stick with it, persevere, and come through on the other side. Yeah. Beautiful.
Great feeling of accomplishment when we finish the trip all the time.
Just like us as believers, a great accomplishment at the end, for sure. You said on your bucket list was to catch a tarpon, the Silver King, you called it, and that would be in Florida. The adventure included an unexpected battle that you talked about between a tarpon and a hammerhead shark. Tell us that story, if you will.
Yeah, I've always wanted to catch a tarpon, and I have friends there who own a boat and knows how to catch them well. They told me, they said, you come down after the first full moon in May and we guarantee that you'll hook a tarpon or we'll give you our boat. I said, well, that's a deal I can't turn down. So I went down at the first full moon in May, which was actually my birthday. I think we went out and fished that day. And sure enough, people know where to fish for tarpon. So there were other boats in the area, but it didn't take long to hook up. We hooked up a number of times during the day. I think I caught about 3 that day and probably lost about 3. But one in particular, we had hooked, and when you hook a tarpon, you're fighting that thing. Probably the one I caught first was about 125 pounds, about 6 feet long. You can't take them out of the water by law, so you can't measure and weigh them. You just have to estimate, because they just wanted to maintain a good, healthy sport fishery. But when you fight those tarpon, it takes 20, 30 minutes to get them in, and you're exhausted by that time, but so is the fish. And so they make an easy target for sharks that come along. And I think sharks have learned to hang out in that area. So we had gotten one near the boat, and then on the radar, my friend Jason sees a shark, and then the shark actually bumps the boat. And then he starts going after the hooked tarpon, which is now near the boat. And the tarpon's swimming around on top of the water, trying in circles, trying to escape him. And you feel bad for the fish, because what can you do? You try to get them in as quickly as possible so they don't get so tired. But it was a large shark. We estimated about 14 feet long, hammerhead, fin sticking out. I got video of it. It was really neat in that sense. But he kept wearing this tarpon out, and finally the tarpon got off the hook, but it was exhausted. And the hammerhead, they have small mouths, so he had to kind of start at the tail and work this guy in to his mouth, and he got him about halfway down his throat, and then he just went down into the deep. That's the last we saw of that one. And we had other shark attacks too, or witnessed them. Other people had tarpon on the line, and a bull shark would come along and just cut it in half. Bull sharks have a different kind of mouth, and they can just cut tarpon in half.
Wow.
So yeah, they have to survive too. They have to eat too.
Yes. And you talk about the fact that the analogy was with the good and evil that we battle, the spiritual battles that we battle. The enemy, I think, likes to wear us down. Life wears us down, and the enemy knows when we're vulnerable, doesn't he?
I think that's exactly the takeaway from that story. If I had to draw a spiritual lesson from it, it's that Satan knows how to exploit our weaknesses, or he can easily exploit us when we are exhausted, tired, vulnerable. And just like that poor tarpon, he didn't have much fight left in him. We had worn him out, and he was vulnerable. And that's what the shark's looking for. That's what Satan's looking for. People who have emotional imbalances or physical ailments or relationship problems. I think that's when Satan's ready to pounce and cause more trouble. And so it's a constant spiritual warfare that we need to be aware of.
Yes, no doubt about it. No doubt. We have really just touched the surface of your book. So many exciting, some funny, some dramatic stories that I hope that our listeners will get a copy of this book and take advantage of it and pass it along to fishermen in their life. But I can guarantee you, like myself, I may not have known all the fishing lingo, but it didn't matter. The stories around it all was just, I loved every moment of it.
Yeah, let me interject that, I have to use the fishing lingo, so to speak, to have credibility with fishermen. But you don't need to understand all of that to appreciate the stories. And I'm very gratified by how the book's been used, and to hear that people are passing it on and giving it away. In one particular instance, somebody gave it to their daughter-in-law to give to their daughter to give to her husband, who was a fishing guide out west. And on the plane back, she read the book, and they had been witnessing to her for years. And on the way back, she read the book on the airplane before she gave it to her husband. And when she got home, she texted back, said, "Oh, I get it now. I got him." You understand what salvation was all about. But I've heard other stories like that too. So it's for the fishermen, but other people read it and have just as much fun with it.
So what would you say in our closing moment, Dr. Bing, to that fisherman that's listening and say, "Oh yeah, I'm one of those that just finds God on the river and don't really need all that Jesus stuff." Share in our closing moment the importance of trusting Jesus.
Well, I'd say enjoy your fishing, enjoy the outdoors, but remember that's a gift from God. God created it, and just like he created you and me, and he wants the best for us. And as beautiful as the world is outdoors, we know that when we get around other people or in the middle of society or inner city or just with a lot of people, there's a lot of wrongdoing. Maybe that's why I like the outdoors so much, but that's called sin, and sin is the problem of mankind that keeps us from knowing God. But God did something about that problem. He sent his perfect son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross, bearing our sins and bearing the penalty for our sins, so that sin is no longer a barrier between us and God. We simply trust in Jesus as the way to God. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And all those who believe in Jesus as their Savior from sin will have eternal life. That means live forever, and there's nothing you can do to lose that eternal life. And that's what life is really all about. It's beyond these years, and it goes for eternity with God.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. Oh, so enjoyed our conversation. Loved your book, the fishing stories, the life lessons learned. Thank you for sharing your love for fishing, Dr. Bing. And thanks to you, our listeners.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Oh, my pleasure. And we thank our listeners as well for tuning in. The book is Fishing for Life. You can find more about Dr. Bing, his books, and the ministry at gsot.edu. That's gsot.edu. Learn about Grace School of Theology there, also the Grace Center for Spiritual Development. You can earn degrees or just grow in your knowledge and love for Jesus. Thanks for joining us. Tell others about saving grace, and remember, the love of Christ can never be earned and can never be lost.
Thank you for listening. For more resources, or to help spread the message of God's life-changing grace, visit our website at gracelife.org. We'd love to hear from you. Send us a message at simplybygrace@gracelife.org. See you next time.